The syringe froze in William Hancock's trembling hand 3 inches from the German shepherd's exposed neck. What he saw in those amber eyes wasn't the rage he expected. It was recognition, and something that looked disturbingly like forgiveness. "Strike 3," he had declared to the empty shelter just moments before, but now his voice caught in his throat. A child's scream pierced the silence from the hallway, followed by the metallic crash of kennels rattling as every dog in the facility erupted into frantic barking. The volunteer who'd been mauled 20 minutes earlier was being rushed to the hospital, her blood still staining the concrete floor where this monster had attacked. But Duke, this 70-pound weapon with teeth, lay perfectly still, watching Hancock with an expression that reminded him of his son Tommy's eyes in those final moments 5 years ago. The same trust, the same innocence that Hancock had failed to protect. "This ends tomorrow," Hancock whispered, but his hand wouldn't move. Behind him a small voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "No, it won't." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Dorothy Patterson turned from the small voice behind her, and there stood her granddaughter, Emma Rose, all 7 years and 43 pounds of stubborn determination, clutching a worn stuffed dog against her chest. The child hadn't spoken a full sentence since the accident 3 months ago, communicating only in whispers and nods. But something about this moment had broken through her silence like sunrise through storm clouds. "Emma, honey, we need to go," Dot said gently, her arthritic hands reaching for the little girl's shoulders. At 69, Dorothy had buried a husband, raised 3 children, and survived more heartbreak than most people could imagine. But nothing had prepared her for suddenly becoming a mother again to this wounded child. This isn't a place for little girls. The Millbrook County Animal Control Facility squatted on the outskirts of town like a concrete afterthought, its chain-link runs and cinder-block walls more prison than sanctuary. Budget cuts had stripped away any pretense of comfort. The walls were institutional green, the fluorescent lights hummed with the persistence of mosquitoes, and the air carried the sharp tang of industrial disinfectant mixed with something sadder and more permanent. William Hancock emerged from the kennel area, his face flushed with the particular anger of a man whose authority had been questioned by someone who barely reached his belt buckle. At 52, he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone perpetually braced for the next disaster. His graying hair was cropped military short, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who'd seen too much go wrong on his watch. "Mrs. Patterson, I told you children aren't allowed in the restricted areas," Hancock said, his voice carrying the weary patience of someone who'd repeated the same rules too many times. "Especially not around that animal. Duke has already had 2 incidents with volunteers. One more, and—" He made a cutting gesture across his throat. Dot felt Emma's small hand slip into hers, surprisingly warm despite the October chill that seemed to seep through the building's thin walls. The child's medical bracelet caught the harsh overhead light. Dorothy Emma Rose Patterson, age 7, guardian, Dorothy M. Patterson. Such official language for such a simple truth. This little girl was all she had left in the world, and Dot was all Emma had too. "Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, Mr. Hancock, but that child has been through enough trauma for one lifetime," Dot said, unconsciously straightening to her full 5'2" height. "We were just looking for some volunteer work, something to keep us busy while—" She stopped herself before mentioning the foreclosure notice folded in her purse, the one that gave them 30 days to find $47,000 or lose the only home Emma had ever known. Behind the kennel door, Duke pressed his black nose against the chain link, amber eyes fixed on Emma with an intensity that made even Hancock take a step back. The German shepherd's ears were pricked forward, alert but not aggressive, as if he was listening to a conversation only he and the little girl could hear. 3 days later, Dot found herself standing in the parking lot of Millbrook County Animal Control at 7:30 in the morning, watching Emma press her small face against the chain-link fence that separated the outdoor runs from the visitor area. The October air carried the scent of dying leaves and something else, the unmistakable smell of institutional neglect that seemed to cling to every government building in their cash-strapped county. "He's waiting for me, Grandma Dot," Emma whispered, her breath fogging the metal links. "See how he sits by the gate?" Dot squinted through her reading glasses and had to admit the child was right. Duke sat perfectly still in his concrete run, his massive head tilted slightly as if listening for something only he could hear. The German shepherd's coat was the color of autumn itself, rich browns and blacks that caught the morning light. But his eyes held a weariness that reminded Dot uncomfortably of her own reflection these days. The foreclosure notice crinkled in her jacket pocket as she shifted her weight from one aching hip to the other. $47,000. The number had been circling her mind like a vulture for 3 days now, picking at every small hope she tried to nurture. Her monthly Social Security check of $1,247 barely covered the basics, and with Emma's needs added to the mix, there was nothing left for emergencies, let alone back taxes on a house that had been in the Patterson family for 60 years. "Mrs. Patterson?" A voice behind her made Dot turn. Dr. Samuel Wheeler approached with the measured gait of a man who'd learned to conserve energy over his 74 years. His weathered hands clutched a thermos of coffee and a manila folder thick with papers. "Thought I might find you here." Emma's been asking about the dog. Sam Wheeler had been Millbrook's only veterinarian for 43 years, before retiring last spring, and his reputation for gentleness with both animals and their owners was legendary. His silver hair had thinned to wisps, and his back had developed the permanent curve of someone who'd spent decades bending over examination tables, but his blue eyes remained sharp with intelligence and compassion. "She hasn't talked this much since the accident," Dot admitted, watching Emma continue her silent conversation with Duke through the fence. "Yesterday she asked me 17 questions about German shepherds." 17? I counted. Sam's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "Smart breed. Loyal to a fault. This one's got military bearing. See how he holds himself? My guess is he's seen some hard service." He opened the folder and withdrew a set of papers. "I did some digging through my contacts at the State Veterinary Board. Duke's got quite a history." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the shelter grounds as Sam spread the papers on the hood of Dot's 15-year-old Honda Civic. Medical records, vaccination certificates, and what looked like official military documentation covered in stamps and seals. "He came here 3 months ago," Sam continued, his finger tracing a timeline across the documents. "Transferred from a military base in Kentucky after his handler was killed in action. The Army tried to place him with the handler's family, but—" Sam's voice trailed off as he studied Dot's face. "The handler's name was Sergeant Marcus Patterson." The world seemed to tilt sideways for a moment, and Dot gripped the car's hood to steady herself. Marcus? Her grandson. Marcus, who'd enlisted against his parents' wishes and died in some God-forsaken desert on the other side of the world. Marcus, whose funeral she'd attended with a flag-draped coffin and military honors and a hole in her heart that still ached 3 years later. "Emma's father," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "Marcus was Duke's handler." Emma must have sensed the shift in the adult's conversation because she turned from the fence, her dark eyes wide with a knowing that seemed far too old for her 7 years. "Daddy's dog is sad, Grandma Dot. He misses Daddy like I do." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The timing of Duke's arrival just weeks before Marcus's parents died in that terrible accident on Highway 231. The way Emma had been drawn to the shelter despite her usual fear of new places. The reason Duke had been languishing here for months without anyone stepping forward to claim him. From inside the building they could hear raised voices. Through the glass doors, Dot saw William Hancock gesturing emphatically at a young woman with a notebook, Rebecca Mills from the Millbrook Gazette, if Dot's guess was right. The shelter director's face was flushed with anger, and even through the thick glass his words carried the sharp edge of a man under pressure. 72 hours, Sam said quietly, following Dot's gaze. That's Hancock's new policy. Any animal not adopted within 3 days gets put down. Claims it's about overcrowding and budget constraints, but he shook his head. Duke's been here 91 days. Hancock's been looking for an excuse. The confrontation came faster than Dot had expected. By noon, word had spread through Millbrook's tight-knit community with the efficiency of a small-town telephone tree. Rebecca Mills had published her story online within hours of interviewing Sam Wheeler, and by the time Dot and Emma returned to the shelter that afternoon, a small crowd had gathered outside the chain-link fence. "Military hero dog sentenced to death by bureaucrat," read the headline that Mrs. Ethel Carmichael waved from her phone screen as she stood among the protesters. At 82, Ethel was the unofficial leader of Millbrook's senior community, and her presence meant this was no longer just about one dog, it was about principle. William Hancock emerged from the building like a man walking to his own execution, his usually pressed uniform wrinkled and his tie askew. The stress lines around his eyes had deepened overnight, and his hands shook slightly as he lit his third cigarette of the hour. Behind him trailed Deputy Sheriff Martinez, whose uncomfortable expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your concerns," Hancock began, his voice carrying across the parking lot with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "But county policy is clear. This facility operates under strict guidelines designed to protect public safety and manage limited resources responsibly." "Horse manure, Bill Hancock!" Ethel's voice cut through his measured tones like a rusty knife. "That dog served his country while you were sitting behind a desk pushing papers. Show some respect." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Dot noticed several veterans among the faces. Men and women whose weathered hands and careful postures spoke of service and sacrifice. Tom Bradley, who'd lost his left leg in Vietnam, leaned heavily on his cane as he stepped forward. "Mr. Hancock, with all due respect, that animal earned the right to live free. He's done more for this country than most folks standing here today." Tom's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd seen real combat. "Putting him down because he doesn't fit your paperwork is just plain wrong." Hancock's face flushed red, and for a moment something raw and desperate flickered in his eyes. "You don't understand the liability we're facing here. One bite, one incident, and this county could be facing a lawsuit that would bankrupt us. I've seen what happens when dangerous animals are allowed to—" "Dangerous?" The voice belonged to Sam Wheeler, who had approached the crowd carrying a thick folder of documents. "I've reviewed this dog's complete military record. Duke has never attacked a human being without direct orders. His 2 incidents here were defensive reactions to aggressive handling by untrained volunteers." Emma tugged on Dot's sleeve, her small face pale with anxiety as the adult voices grew louder and more heated around them. The little girl had remained silent during the drive to the shelter, but Dot could see the wheels turning behind those dark eyes, processing connections that adults were too caught up in their arguments to notice. "He's scared," Emma whispered, pointing toward Duke's kennel, where the German shepherd paced in tight circles, his ears pinned back against the rising voices and tension. All the yelling makes him remember the bad times. Rebecca Mills materialized beside them with her notebook and digital recorder, her young face bright with the enthusiasm of a journalist who'd stumbled onto a story with legs. "Mrs. Patterson, can you comment on your connection to this case? I understand Duke served under your grandson's command?" The question hit Dot like a physical blow, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied thoughts of Marcus. 3 years, and it still felt like yesterday that two soldiers in dress uniforms had knocked on her door with news that would shatter her family forever. "Marcus was a good boy," Dot said quietly, her voice barely audible above the crowd's growing agitation. "He loved animals, had a way with them that was almost magical. If Duke was his partner, then that dog has already sacrificed more than most people ever will." "But surely you understand Mr. Hancock's position," Rebecca pressed, clearly fishing for controversy. "The safety concerns, the budget constraints. I understand a man who's forgotten what it means to honor a commitment," Dot replied, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "When someone or something serves their country, we don't throw them away when they become inconvenient." The argument might have continued indefinitely, but Emma suddenly broke away from Dot's side and walked directly to the fence, separating the crowd from Duke's run. The German shepherd stopped pacing immediately, his entire body going still as he focused on the small figure approaching his enclosure. "Duke," Emma said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet parking lot. "Sit." The massive dog dropped to his haunches immediately, his amber eyes fixed on Emma's face with laser intensity. The crowd fell silent, watching as the 7-year-old girl, who hadn't spoken above a whisper in months, began demonstrating a connection that defied explanation. "Down," Emma commanded softly, and Duke lowered himself to the concrete, his military training evident in the precision of his movements. Hancock's cigarette fell from his lips, forgotten, as he stared at the impossible scene unfolding before him. This was the same animal that had required 2 grown men with catch poles to move just this morning, now responding to commands from a child who barely reached the fence's midpoint. "Stay," Emma whispered, then turned to face the crowd of adults whose arguments had suddenly become irrelevant. "He's not dangerous, he's just sad like me." The next 72 hours transformed Millbrook County into something resembling a media circus. Rebecca Mills's story had been picked up by the Associated Press, and by Thursday morning, news vans with satellite dishes were parked along Main Street like mechanical vultures. The phrase "war hero dog" began trending on social media platforms that most of Millbrook's residents had never heard of, accompanied by a photograph of Emma and Duke that someone had captured through the shelter's chain-link fence. Dot found herself thrust into the unwelcome role of spokesperson for a cause she'd stumbled into by accident. Her phone, a basic flip model that she'd bought at the dollar store 3 years ago, buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, animal rights activists, and veterans organizations from as far away as California. She'd stopped answering after the 15th call, choosing instead to let the voicemail fill up with messages she had no intention of returning. "This is getting out of hand," she confided to Sam Wheeler as they sat in the shelter's small waiting room on Thursday afternoon. Through the glass partition, they could see Emma sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor outside Duke's kennel, reading aloud from a worn copy of Charlotte's Web that had belonged to her mother. The German shepherd lay perfectly still, his amber eyes tracking the movement of Emma's finger across each page. Sam nodded grimly, his weathered hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "Hancock's under tremendous pressure from the county commissioners. They're worried about liability, about setting precedent. If they make an exception for Duke, every pet owner in the county will expect the same treatment." The irony wasn't lost on Dot that Duke's military service, the very thing that made him a hero in the public's eye, also made him more dangerous in the eyes of the law. German shepherds trained for combat carried knowledge that civilian dogs didn't possess, skills that could be lethal if triggered inappropriately. The two incidents that had given Duke his strikes weren't random acts of aggression. They were precise, controlled responses to perceived threats, executed with military efficiency. "He's not a pet," Dot said quietly, watching Emma turn another page. "He's a soldier who's never been told the war is over." The media attention had brought unexpected allies. The veterans of foreign wars had organized a letter-writing campaign to the county commissioners. A GoFundMe page established by someone calling themselves Duke Defender had raised over $30,000 in 2 days. Country music star Travis McKinney, whose own father had served in Vietnam, had posted a video message to his 2 million followers declaring Duke a true American hero who deserves better than bureaucratic betrayal. But success bred its own problems. William Hancock had become increasingly defensive and erratic as the pressure mounted. He'd issued a statement declaring the shelter closed to media and had stationed Deputy Martinez at the entrance to enforce the ban. More troubling were the reports from shelter volunteers about Hancock's behavior behind closed doors, shouting matches with staff, violent slamming of cabinet doors, and the increasingly frequent smell of alcohol on his breath during afternoon meetings. "There's something else," Sam said, pulling a manila envelope from his jacket pocket. "I've been making some calls to colleagues who work with military animals. Duke's case isn't unique. There are dozens of retired military working dogs sitting in shelters across the country, forgotten by the system that trained them." The photograph Sam spread across the coffee table told a heartbreaking story. German shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and Labrador retrievers, all with distinguished service records, all warehoused in facilities not equipped to handle their specialized needs. Some had been abandoned when their handlers were killed or severely wounded. Others had been retired due to age or injury, their years of faithful service reduced to a liability concern for budget-conscious administrators. "The Pentagon spends $200,000 training each of these animals," Sam continued, his voice heavy with disgust. "Then they write them off like surplus equipment when their usefulness expires. It's unconscionable." Emma's voice drifted through the partition as she reached Charlotte's final words to Wilbur. "A friend is never forgotten." The synchronicity wasn't lost on Dot, who felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her granddaughter close the book and whisper something to Duke that made his tail move in what might have been the beginning of a wag. The financial pressure on Dot's household had intensified along with the media attention. Well-meaning supporters had sent checks and care packages to the shelter in Duke's name. But none of that money could touch the $47,000 in back taxes that still threatened to take away the only home Emma had ever known. The mortgage company had called twice this week, their representatives growing increasingly impatient with Dot's promises of working something out. "I can't keep fighting for Duke if I can't even keep a roof over Emma's head," Dot admitted, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "What kind of grandmother am I if I let us both become homeless over a dog?" Sam's blue eyes sharpened with something that might have been anger. "What kind of country are we if we throw away our veterans, human or otherwise, when they become inconvenient? Dorothy, that little girl in there has found something worth fighting for. Don't let bureaucrats and bean counters take that away from her." The afternoon brought another complication. Dr. Patricia Wainwright from the State Veterinary Board arrived unannounced, carrying an official-looking clipboard and wearing the grim expression of someone tasked with delivering bad news. Her examination of Duke was thorough and professional, but Dot could see the concern growing in her eyes as she documented each scar, each flinch response, each sign of psychological trauma that marked the German Shepherd as irreparably damaged goods. "His reflexes are hyperactive," Dr. Wainwright explained to the small group that had gathered in Hancock's office. "Classic signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, While he's clearly bonded with the child, I have serious concerns about his suitability for civilian adoption. One unexpected trigger could result in a catastrophic incident. Hancock leaned back in his chair, a look of vindication spreading across his haggard features. There you have it. Professional assessment confirms what I've been saying all along. This animal represents an unacceptable risk to public safety. Emma appeared in the doorway, having somehow slipped past Deputy Martinez during the commotion. Her small face was streaked with tears, but her voice was steady as she addressed the room full of adults who were deciding Duke's fate. "You don't understand," she said, her 7-year-old wisdom cutting through the professional jargon and bureaucratic posturing. "Duke isn't broken. He's just waiting for someone to tell him it's okay to stop being a soldier." Friday morning brought the kind of October storm that reminded everyone why autumn in Tennessee could be as treacherous as it was beautiful. Thunder rolled across Millbrook County like artillery fire, and the rain fell in sheets that turned the shelter's gravel parking lot into a maze of puddles and mud. Through the waiting room windows, Dot watched reporters huddle under inadequate umbrellas, their satellite trucks creating an electronic village in what had been a quiet country road just a week ago. The Emergency County Commission meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and by 9:30, the shelter's small conference room was packed with more people than it had ever been designed to hold. County Commissioner Barbara Hendricks, a stern woman in her 60s who'd run unopposed for the past 12 years, sat at the head of a folding table that had been borrowed from the Baptist church. Around her, the other commissioners shifted uncomfortably in plastic chairs, while William Hancock stood against the far wall, his face pale and his hands clasped behind his back like a defendant awaiting sentencing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Commissioner Hendricks began, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation, "we're here to address the situation regarding the military working dog currently housed at this facility. I want to make it clear from the outset that this commission has the utmost respect for our veterans, both human and animal, but we also have a responsibility to protect the citizens of this county." Sam Wheeler sat in the front row, his weathered hands gripping a folder thick with documentation. Beside him, Tom Bradley and 3 other veterans formed an unofficial honor guard, their presence a silent reminder of service and sacrifice. Emma sat between Dot and Ethel Carmichael, her small hands folded in her lap and her dark eyes fixed on Commissioner Hendricks with an intensity that made several adults shift uncomfortably. "Mr. Hancock," Commissioner Hendricks continued, "please present your assessment of the situation." Hancock stepped forward, clearing his throat before speaking in a voice that carried none of his usual authority. "Commissioners, Duke represents a clear and present danger to public safety. Despite the emotional appeal of his story, we cannot ignore the professional evaluation that confirms severe psychological trauma and unpredictable behavior patterns. In my 8 years as director of this facility, I have never encountered an animal that poses such a significant liability risk." The lie hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Dot felt Emma's small hand slip into hers, and she squeezed it gently while fighting the urge to stand up and call Hancock what he was, a broken man taking out his own pain on an innocent animal. "Dr. Wheeler," Commissioner Hendricks said, consulting her notes, "I understand you have a different perspective." Sam rose slowly, his arthritis evident in the careful way he straightened his spine. "Commissioners, I've been working with animals for 43 years, and I've never seen a clearer case of a military working dog who simply needs proper rehabilitation. Duke's responses are not unpredictable. They're precisely what you'd expect from a highly trained animal who's been placed in an inappropriate environment and handled by people who don't understand his background." He opened his folder and pulled out a photograph that made several people in the room catch their breath. It showed Duke and a young soldier in desert camouflage, both of them alert and professional as they stood beside what appeared to be a military vehicle. The soldier's face was partially obscured by his helmet, but his stance and bearing spoke of confidence and competence. This photograph was taken 6 months before Sergeant Marcus Patterson was killed in action, Sam continued. Duke served 3 tours of duty, participated in over 200 missions, and is credited with saving the lives of 23 American servicemen and women. The idea that such an animal should be destroyed because he doesn't fit into our civilian bureaucracy is not just wrong, it's shameful. Emma stood up suddenly, her small voice cutting through the formal proceedings like a church bell. "May I say something, please?" Commissioner Hendricks looked startled, glancing around the room as if seeking guidance on proper protocol for 7-year-old testimony. "I suppose that would be appropriate, dear. Please keep it brief." Emma walked to the front of the room with the measured pace of someone much older, her hands clasped behind her back in unconscious mimicry of Hancock's defensive posture. When she turned to face the assembled adults, her dark eyes held a gravity that made Dot's heart ache. "My daddy died fighting for our country," Emma began, her voice steady despite the tremor Dot could detect beneath the surface. "Duke was there when it happened. He tried to save Daddy, but sometimes even the best dogs can't fix everything that's broken." She paused, looking directly at Hancock. "Duke isn't dangerous. He's just carrying too much sadness for one dog to hold." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder. Emma continued, her words falling into that silence like stones into still water. "Grandma Dot says that when someone serves their country, we owe them respect and care, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. Duke served his country. He protected soldiers like my daddy. Now he needs someone to protect him." Commissioner Hendricks cleared her throat, her professional composure clearly shaken by the child's testimony. "Thank you, Emma. That was very illuminating." She shuffled her papers, obviously struggling to regain control of proceedings that had veered far from standard bureaucratic routine. "Before we move to deliberation," she continued, "I want to address the financial aspect of this situation. The county's liability insurance carrier has made it clear that housing animals with documented aggression histories significantly increases our premiums. Additionally, the specialized care required for traumatized military animals falls outside our current budget allocations." Tom Bradley stood up, his cane tapping against the linoleum floor. "Hey, ma'am, with respect, the GoFundMe campaign has already raised over $40,000 specifically for Duke's care. Money isn't the issue here. Political will is." The accusation hit its mark. Commissioner Hendricks's face flushed, and she gripped her gavel with white knuckles. "Mr. Bradley, I resent the implication that this commission's decisions are based on anything other than the best interests of our constituents." Outside, lightning flashed across the storm-darkened sky, illuminating the faces of reporters pressed against the windows like moths drawn to flame. The modern world had arrived in Millbrook County with television cameras and social media hashtags, but the questions being debated in this small room were as old as civilization itself. What do we owe those who serve? How do we balance compassion with pragmatism? And who speaks for those who cannot speak for themselves? The decision came down like a gavel at 3:17 on Friday afternoon, delivered in Commissioner Hendricks's clipped bureaucratic tone that made tragedy sound like paperwork. The commission has voted 4-1 to uphold the county's liability protocols. The animal in question will be humanely euthanized at 8 o'clock Monday morning to ensure compliance with state health regulations. The words hit the crowded conference room like a physical blow. Ethel Carmichael gasped audibly, her weathered hand flying to her chest. Tom Bradley's cane clattered to the floor as he struggled to stand, his face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from watching injustice dressed up in legal language. Outside, the storm had intensified, rain lashing against the windows with a fury that seemed to mirror the emotions erupting inside the small room. "This is unconscionable," Sam Wheeler said, his normally gentle voice carrying an edge that made several commissioners shift uncomfortably in their chairs. "You're executing a war hero to protect yourselves from imaginary lawsuits." Commissioner Hendricks maintained her professional composure, but Dot could see the strain around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she shuffled papers that didn't need shuffling. "Dr. Wheeler, I understand your emotional investment in this case, but we have a responsibility to base our decisions on professional assessments rather than sentiment." Emma had gone very still beside Dot, her small body rigid with the kind of shock that comes before the tears. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room. "You're going to kill Duke?" The simple question, asked with a 7-year-old's devastating clarity, hung in the air like an accusation. Commissioner Hendricks opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently realizing that no amount of bureaucratic language could soften the brutal truth for a child who'd already lost too much. "Honey," Dot said, kneeling beside Emma's chair and gathering the little girl into her arms. "Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make sense. Sometimes they get so worried about following rules that they forget about doing what's right." The reporters outside pressed closer to the windows, their cameras capturing every moment of grief and outrage. Rebecca Mills had her phone out, live streaming the proceedings to social media platforms where the hashtag #SaveDuke was already trending nationally. In the digital age, tragedy moved at the speed of light, and Millbrook County's small-town drama was becoming America's moral crisis in real time. William Hancock had remained silent throughout the proceedings, standing against the back wall like a man at his own trial. His face was ashen, and his hand shook visibly as he lit another cigarette despite the no-smoking signs posted throughout the building. Whatever victory he'd won felt hollow, marked by the kind of pyrrhic satisfaction that destroys the victor along with the vanquished. "There has to be something we can do," Tom Bradley said, retrieving his cane and leaning heavily on it as he addressed the room. "Legal appeals, gubernatorial intervention, something. We don't just roll over and let bureaucrats murder heroes." Sam Wheeler was already pulling out his phone, scrolling through contacts accumulated over 4 decades of veterinary practice. "I'm calling everyone I know, the State Veterinary Board, the ASPCA, the Military Working Dog Associations. Maybe we can get an injunction, buy some time while we figure out next steps." But even as the adults rallied around legal strategies and political pressure, Dot could see the writing on the wall. The commissioners had made their decision with the cold calculation of people protecting themselves from liability rather than serving their constituents. Appeals would take weeks or months, and Duke had less than 72 hours. Emma pulled away from Dot's embrace, her tear-streaked face set with a determination that reminded Dot painfully of Marcus at the same age. "I want to see Duke," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "If he's going to die, he shouldn't be alone." The request should have been simple, a child wanting to comfort a doomed animal, but in the charged atmosphere of the conference room it became another battleground. Commissioner Hendricks frowned, consulting her notes as if they might contain guidance on managing grieving 7-year-olds. "I'm not sure that's appropriate," she began. But Ethel Carmichael cut her off with the authority of someone who'd buried 3 husbands and raised 6 children. "Barbara Hendricks, you've just voted to kill that child's connection to her dead father. The least you can do is let her say goodbye." The storm outside reached a crescendo, thunder shaking the building's thin walls and lightning illuminating the faces pressed against the windows. Inside, the battle lines were drawn not between left and right or young and old, but between those who believed in the power of bureaucracy to solve problems, and those who understood that some problems required something more fundamental than rules and regulations. They required the courage to do what was right, even when it was hard, The truth came spilling out at 2:30 Saturday morning in the parking lot of Murphy's Bar and Grill, where William Hancock sat in his county-issued truck with the engine running and a half-empty bottle of bourbon on the passenger seat. The call had come to Deputy Martinez, who'd found his boss crying into his hands while Duke's euthanasia order lay crumpled on the dashboard like a death warrant he couldn't bring himself to sign. "It wasn't a dog attack," Hancock whispered to Martinez through the open window, his words slurred with alcohol and grief that had been festering for 5 years. "Tommy didn't die because some vicious animal went crazy. He died because I was passed out drunk on the couch when I should have been watching him." The confession hit Martinez like a physical blow. He'd worked with Hancock for 3 years, had seen the man's obsessive crusade against dangerous animals, had watched him implement increasingly harsh policies that seemed to come from some deep wellspring of pain rather than professional judgment. Now the source of that pain was finally revealed. Not righteous anger at vicious beasts, but crushing guilt over his own failures as a father. "The dog was trying to protect Tommy from the neighbor's aggressive pit bull," Hancock continued, his voice breaking as he relived the nightmare that had shaped every decision he'd made since. "But when I woke up and found my son bleeding, I saw what I wanted to see. A monster that needed to be destroyed." It was easier than admitting that I was the monster. By dawn, word of Hancock's breakdown had spread through Millbrook's emergency services network, and by 8 o'clock, Sam Wheeler was standing in the shelter's parking lot with a manila envelope containing documents that would change everything. The veterinarian's silver hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled from a night spent on the phone with contacts across the southeast, but his blue eyes blazed with the intensity of a man who'd found the key to unlock an impossible situation. "Duke isn't just any military working dog," Sam announced to the small crowd that had gathered for what many assumed would be a death vigil. "He's part of a classified program called Operation Faithful Guardian, an elite unit of animals trained specifically to work with special forces in the most dangerous combat situations." The documents Sam spread across the hood of Dot's Honda told a story that Hollywood would have dismissed as too far-fetched for fiction. Duke's service record showed participation in covert operations across 3 countries, including a mission where he'd single-handedly detected an improvised explosive device that would have killed an entire convoy of American soldiers. His final mission, the one where Marcus Patterson had died, involved infiltrating a terrorist compound to rescue hostages. The Pentagon classified his record to protect operational security, Sam continued, his voice carrying across the parking lot to the reporters who'd been maintaining their vigil despite the county commission's decision. "But a friend of mine at the Defense Department confirmed that Duke is one of only 12 animals in American military history to receive the equivalent of a Medal of Honor." Emma sat cross-legged beside Duke's outdoor run, her small hands pressed against the chain-link fence as she listened to the adults discuss her father's dog in language that made him sound like something from a movie rather than the sad, gentle animal who'd been responding to her whispered commands for the past week. Duke lay on his side in the morning sun, his amber eyes fixed on Emma's face with the absolute focus that marked him as something far more sophisticated than a simple pet. "It doesn't matter," Rebecca Mills said, lowering her phone after checking the latest social media updates. "I've been in contact with the county attorney's office. They say Hancock's personal problems don't change the liability assessment. Duke is still scheduled for euthanasia at 8 o'clock Monday morning unless someone with legal standing intervenes." The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Duke's extraordinary service record, the very thing that made him a hero in the public imagination, also made him more dangerous in the eyes of the law. A dog trained to detect explosives and neutralize enemy combatants carried knowledge that no civilian animal possessed. His 2 defensive incidents at the shelter weren't random acts of aggression. They were precise, controlled responses executed with military efficiency. "There's one more thing," Sam said quietly, pulling a final document from his envelope. "I received this by overnight courier from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It's a letter of commendation signed by General Patricia Morrison, explaining that Duke's handler, Sergeant Marcus Patterson, was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for heroism in his final mission." Dot felt the world tilt sideways as Sam handed her the letter, its official letterhead and formal language transforming her grandson from a name on a headstone into something larger and more significant. Marcus had died a hero, and Duke had been there beside him, witnessing and sharing in that final act of courage. "Emma," Dot called softly. "Come here, sweetheart. There's something you need to know about your daddy." The little girl approached with the careful steps of someone who'd learned that adult conversations often contained painful truths. When Dot showed her the letter, Emma studied it with the intense concentration of a child who'd been forced to grow up too quickly, her finger tracing the official seal as if it were a talisman. "Daddy was brave," Emma said finally, her voice carrying a note of pride that hadn't been there before. "And Duke was brave with him." But even as the adults rallied around the new revelations about Duke's service record, the practical realities remained unchanged. The county commission had made its decision based on legal liability rather than moral consideration. Appeals would take weeks or months to wind through the court system, and Duke had less than 48 hours. Tom Bradley, who'd been making phone calls since sunrise, approached the group with news that sent a chill through everyone present. "I've been in touch with veterans organizations across the Southeast. They're organizing a convoy to Millbrook, hundreds of vehicles, maybe thousands of people. They plan to surround the shelter Monday morning and physically prevent the euthanasia." The prospect of a confrontation between armed veterans and county law enforcement officials brought a new level of urgency to the situation. What had begun as a local dispute over animal control policy was escalating into something that could easily turn violent, with Duke caught in the middle of a battle between competing versions of American values. "This can't happen," Dot said, her voice tight with anxiety as she imagined the chaos that would unfold in Millbrook's quiet streets. "Emma doesn't need to see grown men fighting over a dog. She's been through enough trauma for one lifetime." Emma looked up from the letter she'd been studying, her dark eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed far too old for her 7 years. "Grandma Dot," she said quietly, "what if there's another way? What if Duke could show everyone that he's not dangerous anymore?" The suggestion hung in the morning air like a prayer, offering hope where none had existed before. But how could one traumatized dog prove his worthiness to live when the deck was already stacked against him? The miracle began at 6:15 Sunday evening, when Emma Rose Patterson walked into the Millbrook County Animal Control Facility, carrying her father's military service Bible and wearing the small gold cross that had belonged to her mother. Deputy Martinez, who'd been assigned to maintain security during the facility's final weekend before Duke's scheduled execution, watched in amazement as the 7-year-old girl approached the German Shepherd's kennel with the solemnity of someone attending a funeral. "Duke," Emma said softly, settling cross-legged on the concrete floor just outside the chain-link door. "I need to tell you something important about Daddy." Behind her, Dot stood with Sam Wheeler and Tom Bradley, their faces etched with the hollow exhaustion of people who'd fought a battle they were about to lose. The GoFundMe campaign had reached $67,000. Hundreds of veterans were driving toward Millbrook from across the Southeast. The story had been picked up by CNN and Fox News, turning a small-town animal control dispute into a national referendum on how America treats its heroes. But none of it mattered. At 8 o'clock Monday morning, Duke would be given a lethal injection, and all the social media outrage in the world wouldn't change that fact. Emma opened her father's Bible to a page marked with a faded ribbon, her small finger tracing words that had been underlined in Marcus's careful handwriting. "Daddy marked this verse before he went to heaven," she told Duke, her voice carrying the gravity of a child delivering a final message. "It says, 'Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends.'" Duke approached the fence slowly, his amber eyes fixed on Emma's face with an intensity that made the watching adults hold their breath. This was the same animal that had required two men with catch-poles to move just a week ago, now drawn forward by nothing more than a child's voice and whatever mysterious connection had formed between them. "Daddy died saving his friends," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "And you tried to save Daddy. That makes you both heroes, and heroes don't get forgotten." What happened next would be replayed on news programs and social media platforms for months afterward, analyzed by animal behaviorists and military trainers who struggled to explain the impossible. Duke pressed his nose through the chain-link fence and gently touched Emma's outstretched hand, his massive head lowering until it rested against the wire barrier that separated them. For the first time since arriving at the shelter 3 months earlier, Duke's entire body relaxed. The hyper-vigilant posture that marked him as a warrior on eternal duty gave way to something softer, more vulnerable. His tail, which had remained rigidly still throughout his imprisonment, moved in a tentative wag that spoke of hope, cautiously reborn. "That's it, boy," Emma whispered, her other hand opening Marcus's Bible to a photograph tucked between the pages. It showed a young man in desert camouflage kneeling beside a German shepherd, both of them squinting against harsh sunlight, both of them bearing the alert confidence of professional soldiers. "See? That's you and Daddy together. You were a team." Sam Wheeler pulled out his phone, his weathered fingers surprisingly steady as he began recording what he instinctively knew would be important documentation. "Look at his stress indicators," he murmured to Dot, his veterinarian's eye cataloging the changes in Duke's posture and breathing. Ears forward but relaxed, respiratory rate normalizing, muscle tension releasing. "This is what we've been trying to achieve for 3 months." Tom Bradley leaned heavily on his cane, his combat veteran's understanding of trauma and healing giving him insight into what they were witnessing. "She's giving him permission to stand down," he said quietly. "That dog's been waiting for orders that never came. She's finally telling him the mission is complete." Outside, the convoy of veterans had begun arriving earlier than expected. Pickup trucks with American flags and military bumper stickers filled the parking lot, their drivers spilling out to form an impromptu honor guard that stretched from the shelter entrance to the main road. Word had spread through veterans' networks that something significant was happening, and they'd come to bear witness to what might be Duke's final hours. The crowd that gathered outside the shelter windows was unlike anything Millbrook County had ever seen. Gray-haired men who'd served in Vietnam stood beside younger veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. Women who'd broken barriers in military service mixed with Gold Star mothers whose sons and daughters had paid the ultimate price. All of them united by a common understanding that Duke represented something larger than one dog's fate. He was a symbol of how America treated those who'd served and sacrificed. Rebecca Mills moved through the crowd with her camera and notebook, capturing testimonials from veterans who'd traveled hundreds of miles to stand vigil for a dog they'd never met. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had driven from Fort Campbell with a carload of active duty soldiers on weekend leave. Master Sergeant James Washington had flown in from North Carolina, carrying a photograph of his own military working dog partner who'd been killed by an IED in Fallujah. "This isn't just about Duke," Washington told Rebecca, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen too much war and not enough peace. This is about whether we keep our promises to those who serve. That dog earned the right to live free, same as any human veteran. Inside the shelter, Emma continued her vigil, reading passages from Marcus's Bible and sharing memories that she'd been too young to understand when they happened, but that took on new meaning in the presence of her father's partner. She told Duke about the letters Marcus had sent home, describing a four-legged angel who'd saved his life more times than he could count. She showed him the Purple Heart that had been presented to her at Marcus's funeral, explaining that heroes like Duke deserved medals too. As the evening wore on, the scene outside the shelter took on the atmosphere of a peaceful protest mixed with a religious revival. Someone had brought a portable speaker and hymns drifted across the parking lot while veterans shared stories of their own service animals. Candles appeared as darkness fell, creating a constellation of flickering lights that could be seen from Main Street. William Hancock arrived at 9:30, his county truck moving slowly through the crowd like a boat navigating troubled waters. The man who emerged from the driver's seat bore little resemblance to the confident administrator who'd implemented the 72-hour rule. His face was gaunt, his clothes wrinkled, and his hands shook with what might have been alcohol withdrawal or simple emotional exhaustion. "I need to see the dog," Hancock told Deputy Martinez, his voice barely audible above the crowd's murmur. "Before tomorrow morning, I need to see him one more time." Martinez escorted Hancock into the shelter, where the man who'd signed Duke's death warrant found himself face to face with the child who'd become the dog's most powerful advocate. Emma looked up from her father's Bible, her dark eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 7 years. "Mr. Hancock," she said with the formal politeness her grandmother had taught her, "do you want to meet Duke properly? I can show you how to talk to him so he won't be scared." The offer hung in the air between them. Forgiveness extended by a child to the man who'd sentenced her father's dog to death. Hancock approached the kennel slowly, his administrative authority stripped away to reveal something raw and human underneath. "I'm sorry," Hancock whispered, the words directed as much to Duke as to Emma. "I've been angry for so long that I forgot how to see clearly. My son Tommy would have loved you." Duke looked up at Hancock with those intelligent amber eyes, and for a moment the shell-shocked administrator saw past his own pain to recognize another damaged soul seeking redemption. In that recognition lay the seed of something that might eventually grow into forgiveness, both given and received. The night stretched ahead, filled with uncertainty and the promise of morning's reckoning. But for now, in this small circle of understanding, hope flickered like candlelight against the darkness. Monday morning dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that October in Tennessee sometimes offers as consolation for summer's end. The sun rose over Millbrook County like a benediction, casting long shadows across the parking lot where hundreds of veterans maintain their vigil outside the animal control facility. At 7:30, exactly 30 minutes before Duke's scheduled execution, Emma Rose Patterson walked through that crowd carrying her father's folded American flag and wearing a resolve that seemed far too heavy for her 7-year-old shoulders. The veterans parted before her like water, their weathered faces reflecting a mixture of respect and heartbreak as they watched this child march toward what might be her final goodbye with her father's war dog. Some of them had children and grandchildren Emma's age, and the sight of her small figure carrying that triangular flag struck them with the force of personal loss. This was what they'd all been fighting for, not just Duke's life, but the principle that service and sacrifice meant something beyond the convenience of bureaucrats. Inside the shelter, William Hancock sat in his office with Duke's euthanasia order spread across his desk like evidence at a trial. The papers had been signed and witnessed, the veterinarian notified, the lethal injection prepared according to state protocols. Everything was ready for 8 o'clock. Yet Hancock found himself paralyzed by the memory of Emma's words from the night before. Heroes don't get forgotten. Dr. Patricia Wainwright from the State Veterinary Board had arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, her medical bag containing the drugs that would end Duke's life with clinical efficiency. She'd performed hundreds of euthanasias during her career, approaching each one with the professional detachment necessary to function in a field where death was sometimes the kindest option. But as she watched Emma approach Duke's kennel, something in the child's dignity made her question whether this particular death served any purpose beyond legal protection. "Duke," Emma said softly, kneeling beside the chain-link door and unfolding her father's flag with careful reverence, "I brought Daddy's flag to show you. The soldiers gave it to Grandma Dot when Daddy went to heaven, and she said I could share it with you because you're a soldier too." Duke approached the fence with the measured steps of a military dog responding to ceremony. His amber eyes fixed on the flag's red, white, and blue fabric with an intensity that suggested recognition, not of the specific flag, but of what it represented. Throughout his 3 tours of duty, Duke had seen dozens of flag-draped coffins, had stood at attention during memorial services for fallen handlers and soldiers. The sight of those colors triggered something deeper than training. It awakened memories of duty, honor, and sacrifice that transcended species. Sam Wheeler stood behind Emma with his medical bag, prepared to offer whatever comfort he could during what everyone assumed would be Duke's final moments. The veterinarian had spent the sleepless night reviewing Duke's case files, searching for some medical justification to delay the execution, but the state's protocols were clear. An animal with documented aggression incidents and professional assessment of psychological instability posed an unacceptable risk to public safety. "There's something I need to tell you," Emma continued, her voice carrying across the kennel to where the adults stood in silent witness. "Dr. Wheeler found out that you and Daddy saved 23 soldiers. 23 people got to go home to their families because you were brave. That's why Daddy loved you so much." Outside, the crowd had swelled to nearly 1,000 people as word spread through social media that Duke's final moments were approaching. Television news crews positioned themselves along the perimeter, their cameras capturing what had become a national symbol of America's treatment of its veterans. The hashtag #SaveDuke had generated over 2 million posts, turning a small-town animal control decision into a referendum on values that went far beyond one dog's fate. Rebecca Mills moved through the crowd with her recorder, capturing testimonials from veterans who'd traveled from across the country to bear witness. Master Sergeant David Chen had driven straight through from Colorado with his own retired military working dog, a Belgian Malinois named Ranger who'd lost his left rear leg to an IED in Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh had flown in from Washington State, carrying photographs of the explosive detection dog who'd saved her unit 3 times before being killed in action. "This is about keeping faith with those who serve," Chen told Rebecca, his voice thick with emotion as Ranger pressed against his leg for comfort. "We ask these animals to risk everything for our country, same as human soldiers. If we throw them away when they become inconvenient, what does that say about our values?" At 7:45, Commissioner Barbara Hendricks arrived at the shelter in her official county vehicle, her face set with the grim determination of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. The political pressure had been enormous. Phone calls from the governor's office, threats of lawsuits from both sides, and a media circus that had turned her quiet county into a national battleground. But the law was clear, and elected officials who ignored legal liability in favor of emotional appeals rarely remained in office long. "Mrs. Patterson," Commissioner Hendricks said as she approached Emma's vigil, I want you to know that this decision brings no one any pleasure. We understand Duke's service to our country, but we also have a responsibility to protect our citizens from potential harm." Emma looked up from the flag she'd been showing Duke, her dark eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed to pierce through bureaucratic justifications to reach something more fundamental. "Commissioner Hendricks," she said, with the formal politeness her grandmother had taught her, "what if Duke could prove he's not dangerous anymore? What if he could show everyone that he remembers how to be good?" The question hung in the morning air like a challenge, offering one final opportunity for redemption in a situation that seemed to offer only tragedy. Commissioner Hendricks glanced at her watch, 7:48, then at the crowd of veterans whose vehicles now stretched for miles along every road leading to the shelter. "Emma," she said gently, "sweetheart, we're past the point of tests and demonstrations. The law requires that we follow through with our decision, regardless of personal feelings." But Emma was already standing, her small hands working to unlock the heavy padlock that secured Duke's kennel door. The adults reacted with alarm, Sam Wheeler stepping forward to prevent what could become a catastrophic incident, but Emma's voice stopped them all. "Duke," she said with the clear authority of someone issuing a military command. "At ease. Present arms." What happened next defied every professional assessment, every psychological evaluation, every bureaucratic justification that had led to this moment. Duke rose to his full height and executed a perfect military salute, front paws together, head held high, eyes fixed straight ahead with the bearing of a soldier standing for inspection. The movement was precise, controlled, and utterly without aggression. For 30 seconds that felt like eternity, the German shepherd held the salute while Emma stood beside him with her father's flag, creating a tableau that captured everything noble about service and sacrifice. The crowd outside fell silent as news of what was happening inside spread through their ranks. Veterans who'd maintained their vigil through the night found themselves standing at attention, their own hands moving instinctively to salute position as they honored both the child and the dog who'd given them all a lesson in dignity under pressure. Dr. Wainwright lowered her medical bag, her professional assessment crumbling before the evidence of her own eyes. This wasn't the behavior of a dangerous, unstable animal. This was a soldier responding to proper command, demonstrating the kind of discipline and control that 3 tours of combat duty had ingrained in his very bones. Commissioner Hendricks pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through contacts to find the number she needed. At 7:52, with 8 minutes remaining before Duke's scheduled execution, she placed a call that would change everything. "Governor Morrison's office? This is Commissioner Hendricks from Millbrook County. I need to speak with the governor immediately about granting an emergency stay of execution for a military working dog. Yes, I'll hold." Emma knelt beside Duke as he maintained his salute, her small hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture of partnership that transcended species. "Good boy," she whispered. "Daddy would be so proud of both of us." At 74 years old, I've buried too many friends and watched too many heroes fade into forgotten files. But Emma Patterson's story reminds us that some battles are worth fighting, no matter how impossible they seem. When that 7-year-old child stood beside Duke with her father's flag, she wasn't just saving a dog. She was defending the promise we make to everyone who serves. That sacrifice means something, that loyalty runs both ways, that we don't abandon those who've given everything for others. How many of us have watched our own loved ones, spouses, children, neighbors, get lost in systems that treat people like paperwork? How many times have we stayed silent when we should have spoken up? Emma found her voice for Duke because she understood what too many adults forget. That keeping faith with those who serve isn't about politics or policies. It's about the kind of people we choose to be. Whether it's a war dog or a veteran struggling with PTSD, an elderly neighbor facing eviction, or a grandchild who needs someone to believe in them, we all have the power to stand up and say, "Not on my watch." Sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truth. Discussion questions. What promises have you made, or seen others make, to those who serve their country? And how well have we kept those commitments in your community? When was the last time you found the courage to speak up for someone who couldn't speak for themselves? And what did that experience teach you about the power of taking a stand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter, and they might just inspire someone else to find their voice when it matters most.